Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Association of the United States Army's annual conference and trade show in Washington, D.C., the #1 gathering of U.S. Army leaders from around the world. Our coverage here is sponsored by General Motors Defense, Bell, L3 Harris, and Leonardo DRS. We had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Bruce Jette, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology. This is part 2 of our 3-part interview with Dr. Jette. It would appear, and I have a logistics question to ask you in a little bit, but it's fascinating to see how the manufacturing process is changing and how much more flexible it's becoming, which then has mobilization and surge advantages for you, right? Because you can now something may not necessarily be a prototype, right? Model-based design lets you get up these curves much more quickly, so you can actually do small batch targeted production of systems that you need on a timely basis, which I think was even unprecedented a few years ago.
Yeah, no, you're hitting on an area that I just had conversation with the Secretary over. In the past, what we did was we built an M1 tank. And for 40 years, that was what our tank was. I mean, fundamentally, it was unchanged. We did improvements to it, but there's not a lot of difference between the M1 and the M1 A2 SEP V3. Yeah. Okay, I have to keep all these names straight. So it's this core design that we retain all the way through, even though there are possibly inside of that core design some new capabilities that we could put in place, but we haven't versioned anything. So one of the things we're looking at is versioning. So units may get, the new combat vehicle number 1, and then the next unit may get new combat vehicle number 2. The new combat number 1 and number 2 may be the same vehicle with significant modifications, or they may be a significantly different vehicle. The function is the critical piece, as opposed to the physical vehicle itself. That way we can insert the new technologies as rapidly as possible and keep ourselves ahead of any contenders that might try to show up at the battlefield.
One of the important things, I would love to stay talking about that, so hopefully I will get back to you because I'm fascinated to sort of plumb that depth a little bit, but I want to keep going because there are a number of other serious, large questions to discuss. The Army has started the Night Court process. Former Army Secretary Mark Esper and the team started it. He's obviously now Defense Secretary. Ryan McCarthy is continuing that process as well. There's an understanding that the department is not likely going to get as much money as it wants, so it's going to have to make some hard trade-offs. That was what the whole Night Court process was all about. Each of the other services is adopting something very similar to look at what are we going to sunset in order to underwrite investment in new capabilities, whether they're hypersonics, whether they're artificial intelligence. Talk to us a little bit about making some of these major trade-offs because, again, as we briefly discussed, in the case of the Chinook, that was a big decision, but it went a different way, in part because you have a board of 535 members who have their own ideas on how this should be run. How do you do this? How do you do it right? How do you sunset things that really should be sunset to free investment on future capabilities at a very dynamic and changing environment?
So the first cut at Night Court is somewhat different from the cut that we're doing now. So we've somewhat institutionalized the base approach. For people that don't really understand how the budgeting process works within the Pentagon, we have something called PEGs. They're chunks of money. So we have an EE PEG. I don't know why we keep it. There's EE, IISS. I guess the guy just typed double letters on the keyboard when he put it up, but they're all double letters.
If anybody in the audience can answer this question, you should get back to Dr. Jette with an answer on it.
I would love to know how we ended up with 2 letters for everything when 1 would have been sufficient. But the EE PEG is the equipping PEG, the SS PEG is the sustainment PEG, and this sort of thing. What each PEG has is co-chairs who are primary proponents associated with the business side and the Secretariat and the operational side in the Army. And then you have the G8 of the Army who kind of does the budgeting process in the background. What we're doing for this Night Court process now is a very deliberate look at the technical, both the operational and technical and business aspects of the different programs that are put in front of us. I would say one of the things that when you were asking the question, you sort of implied that there was this need just to cut funding, and in order to accommodate a budget line. And I don't really think that was the focus, and I know it's not the focus of us right now. What we're doing is we're taking a look at what were systems that we have on the books that we're developing, that we're investing in, that are kind of should be sunset. We're not doing that anymore. We don't need that. The world has moved on. Yes, it defends against this, but now I have this threat, and if I can do this threat, then I don't need this threat to be a threat anymore. I can deal with it with this, but if I keep this, I can't deal with this threat.
Or I can better use that money elsewhere for AI or hypersonics
Yes.
or 5G or any number of other investments which would be important for the future of the service.
Right, and just like anything else, warfare evolves, technology and opportunities evolve, how we would fight changes, and so reallocation of the funding against those different programs was what the cornerstone of what we were trying to do was. So when the commander of Army Futures Command, Mike Murray, and we're co-chairs for the EEPEG, we both sit there. Mike is responsible for laying out the operational aspect of a requirement for a given program, and then I take a look at the business side for a program. And we jointly then keep the program, increase the program, decrease the program. He will look at the operational aspect of things. How does it fit? What's a fielding plan, et cetera, and say, yeah, I need more of them. I need them this much time. I need them by that time. And then conversely, I'll look at him. He'll say, if he was to, we don't need those anymore. Okay, how much money do you think you're going to get back? I'm going to get $100 million back. Well, no, we already paid for $80 million, so you're only getting $20 million. It's just $20 million worth canceling a program at this point. So we do the business case piece there as well. And we do that with a view towards the logistics and sustainment. I'm the co-chair with the Army Materiel Commander, Gus Perna, General Gus Perna, on the SS PEG. So I've got him on my, kind of left of me over here telling me the future, and him behind me showing me the sustainment. And then we try to balance it in the middle.
Let me ask you about the overall macro relationship with Army Futures Command. There's been a little bit of griping in the community about the new tension that this might introduce. There are some folks who say the system is working really well. There are others who say that it's working maybe a little bit less well, that requirements are maybe getting a little bit too ambitious. In some cases, you're working on a daily basis with the Futures team, not just with General Murray. What's working right? Where do you see room for improvement?
So I get somewhat asked this question, and look, if you've ever been anywhere where you're trying to build a new organization and change how things are done, there's a well-known, there's storming, forming, and norming, okay? You throw this mix in together, and people have to redefine their boundaries and responsibilities. So there's some forming or storming that's gone on, and we've kind of worked through the vast majority of, well, what do you really mean, and et cetera. And occasionally we have a tornado roll by, and occasionally we have a thunderstorm roll by, but in essence, we're doing pretty well. The PEOs and the CFTs, for the most part, are co-located, not completely, just because of geography impacts. But and they seem to be working fairly well together. Certainly, I work well with General Murray and his team. We get along quite well, and I will tell you this. So in the past, this is how acquisition worked. You had a requirement. Here's the acquisition. You come together, and you'd push and pull like this. But eventually, it just got passed across. So you define the requirement. You go do it. That's not the case. Many of my acquisition professionals, PMs and PEOs in particular, are former military officers, or are military officers, former field officers. You have to at least been a company commander to be considered for acquisition. So you're 6 or 7 years in before you come into the acquisition community. You've got operational experience. Most of them have combat patches. And so they come to the table with a pretty deep understanding of operational requirements. but their responsibility is the material solution, and then they spend a great deal of time going to graduate school and various experiences, time with industry, et cetera, where they develop their understanding of the material aspect of things. On the other hand, you have a lot of operators who have even more experience in the operational community come in, and they start working on the acquisition side, trying to define the requirements. And so instead of this, what AFC and the acquisition community are trying to do in particular is bring the two of us together. Now there's push and pull, and I want this, well, you can get that, but you can't get that in the timeline you want. And so we push and pull together, but in the end, they're responsible for their requirement. We're responsible for getting the product delivered. And but this interaction, they can talk about acquisition policy, we can talk about the requirements. And it's a much more open exchange of data than in the past.
Let's talk about two programs because there are some folks who have expressed a little bit of concern about it. One is the optionally manned fighting vehicle. Three very strong teams went into it. One was disqualified, the Rheinmetall Raytheon team, for not getting their vehicle in, or at least that's what we understand in news reports and statements from leadership. BAE Systems has decided not to bid on it. There's some questions about whether that was a requirements issue or focus on existing amount of work that they looked at as very fulsome in terms of the A7 version of the M109 self-propelled howitzer, as well as the OMFV program to replace M113s with Bradley chassis vehicles on the personnel carrier side of things and multi-purpose vehicle side of it. And so now you look like you have a competition that just has General Dynamics in it. Very good vehicle, but at the end of the day gives you just one vehicle in terms of something that was supposed to be a more aggressive competition. And there are folks who look at, for example, the Scout helicopter replacement, the FARA program, and say, well, this is something that actually resembles a lot more of an Apache than it does necessarily a Scout at the end of the day, and whether or not it actually is the attack helicopter replacement. How do you comment on both of these programs about whether or not you have enough competition and choice at the end of the day on the combat vehicle, on the armored vehicle side of things, and then maybe a lack of clarity from the perception of some, even those involved in the helicopter program, of sort of being like, yeah, we're not exactly sure whether or not this helicopter is, a Scout at the end of the day or an attack helicopter. So how do you respond to both of those?
So OMFV is in competition still, and because it's in that status, I legally can't discuss any of the specifics of the acquisition process. I can discuss generally the concept of acquisition and competition within the next generation combat vehicle. So OMFV is a subset of NGCV. There are other things that will come along as well. And so our objective is to increase competition overall and get more players involved. So let me give you a little bit of an idea of this. I alluded to it in one of your earlier questions. If I develop something that's 1.0, doesn't mean it's going to be 2.0. So if you happen to win 1.0, doesn't guarantee you win 2.0. If you don't win 1.0, doesn't mean that you're not competitive for 2.0. In fact, even in the structured acquisition, the part I can talk about on OMFV, there's a competition in 3 years to go to LRIP. Now, somebody you might say if I've won a position on a team for a 1.0, but I'm getting to the LRIP decision, the low rate initial production decision, how can somebody just step in there? Well, there are a lot of really good vehicles downstairs. It becomes something of an internal investment decision. But the secondary piece to that is, for either OMFV 1.0 or OMFV 2.0 or some hybrid of either, we will be continuing to develop our new technologies, which the government will develop and have possession of. Again, goes back to our management of our IP correctly, so that we can insert those things into the vehicles coming downstream. Therefore, what happens is 1.0 that you might see at the beginning of a bid process might not look like 1.0 when you get to the LRIP decision. Just like competitors who might have something that might not have even been considered in a bid process when they take a look at some of the technologies that we're going to put on the street for available qualified vendors to look at inserting into their system, they may show up at the front gate and say, hey, by the way, we got that working in ours, which makes them a much more competitive entity at the LRIP position, where they can turn around and say, I think I'm going to wait and bid on the 2.0. So we're not looking at this as just a single buy. We're looking at this as a long-term progression towards keeping a continuous but definable spiral of technology insertions as we go along.
And on FARA, how do you respond to the question of maybe somewhat of a lack of clarity or some confusion in the mind of even those some involved in it as to what the program is actually trying to achieve?
Well, so I'm not nearly as well versed on some of the details of aviation assets, so being able to get me to comment on specific characteristics of an aviation platform would be would not be my strength. But the requirement for having an aviation platform that can do scouting and is armed is a bit of a cross between what you might consider, let's say, an OH-58 scout helicopter and an attack helicopter might have. It's certainly not a heavy attack helicopter, but at the same time, ultralight scout helicopters have survival difficulties on the battlefield if they encounter something. Or, better yet, if they have an opportunity to do something and the best they can do is go, I found it, now what do I do? And have to call for backup. So part of the objective of what transforming this light helicopter into was an ability to be able to have some good meat on its bones when it got to a fight. But you'll yet be small enough and agile enough to be able to still slink around the battlefield, stay hidden, use trees, those type of things to mask itself from radars and such.
Right.
And the development of being able to put weapons on that platform generally is not totally unique. I mean, we do that with a lot of our special ops helicopters that are small.
And I made an error. It's future armed reconnaissance aircraft, and I said future attack and reconnaissance aircraft. So I stand corrected, so that there's lack of clarity in general. Francis doesn't get upset at me because we're going to be talking to him about that as well.